I'm going to be using the scene I have loaded in to show basically what renders what, and also some of the errors you can run into back and forth between the two programs, and kind of how to fix some of those problems. The current scene is a Cinema 4D object, this turtle I have loaded in, and the other Cinema 4D object is this sphere. And the sphere has a reflective material on it, which is just the basic sphere and is causing a few render disturbances, especially in the reflection of the water. The water is just the ground plane with the water material on it, and that is reflecting the rest of the scene. This sphere has a lot of problems with the anti-aliasing and a lot of distortion in the reflection of the reflection. And then I've just got a cloud layer added in, just a standard terrain, a little bit of a grass ecosystem, and then one of the trees. One thing you'll note, and I'm just using the lower quality settings right now for the rendering. If we take a look at the render settings, anti-aliasing I have set to geometry. And because of that, only the Cinema 4D objects are going to look decent with the anti-aliasing. And the view objects aren't going to look all that great, because right now I have it set to automatic based on the native renderer sampling quality, and that match between anti-aliasing is really quite different. For the most part, all anti-aliasing is controlled by Cinema, with the exception of materials or reflections. And that would be reflections of view objects reflecting the scene. In this case, we have the water reflecting the turtle, so that reflection, the turtle outline, is anti-aliased in Cinema, and then the settings for the rest of it are going to be view. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this sphere and make that problem that we were seeing a little more obvious. And I'm going to just do this by setting it in the water pretty close to the camera. And you're really going to be able to see the issues because of this. I'm just going to open up the atmosphere editor and turn off that cloud layer for now. I'm just really not going to need it in order to see the problems that are going to show up. So the main thing we can see right now is this distortion around the edge of the sphere, and also the reflection within the view water. We have a lot of graininess and some disturbances, almost looking like a very, very fine bump map. But obviously it's not reflecting correctly, and that's a little bit of a problem. Now, this is a really easy fix. All you have to do is bake the object to polygons, or make it editable. So you could use the Cinema option to make the sphere editable. Now it is polygons. We'll go ahead and render that again. And now you can see that all of the distortion is gone. So anytime you have Cinema 4D with a reflective surface, that geometry needs to be real geometry. It needs to be a polygonal surface. Otherwise, you're going to run into a lot of issues. And if you take a look at the grass right now that's in the lower right of the screen, it basically looks like crap. Very low render quality setting, and the anti-aliasing on all ecosystems and grass is just any sort of material like that is handled by Vue's texture anti-aliasing. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, it's pretty much handled by Vue's render settings. So if we wanted to increase the quality of this render, one thing I'm going to do is just take this sphere and I'm going to go ahead and turn it off in the render and the OpenGL. And we're going to go just using changes in cinema, changing our anti-aliasing to best. And I'm just going to set the minimum to 1 by 1, the max to 2 by 2. So it's not a great amount of anti-aliasing, but it is better than what we had before. And it's going to take longer to render because now Vue is matching its own settings to be a little bit closer to what Cinema has. So as this renders, we're already going to notice that the tree looks a lot better around the edges, and the leaves up at the top are looking better. So we'll go ahead and let this finish up. And now, even with the low quality render setting, you can see that everything looks much better. The anti-aliasing on all of the view elements has greatly improved. The cinema object, just about the same. But we can take a look at the grass and see that texture and the alpha on there is now much smoother. Of course, these settings are still fairly low, and whether or not you want to separate the two renderers is really going to depend on the scene you're working on, how many view elements there are compared to how many cinema elements. If we open up the xStream options, you can set it to view render options, and now you have the ability to change anything that affects just view. So you can either use the presets, Final, Broadcast, Superior, Ultra, and then you can go into user settings and define everything yourself. So your reflections and trace levels can be defined, and these are going to affect only the elements that would be reflective, basically as part of the view scene. You can also edit the texture anti-aliasing. Using texture filtering is really useful for animation of ecosystems. Usually setting that to 25 to 30% can work pretty well. So you can enable or turn off the texture anti-aliasing. You can also set up the G buffer and the multipass for the view scene. And the G buffer is currently only available as RLA and RPF formats. But you can also go into the multipass buffer, which has some of the similar elements and similar passes, although it does not have the velocity, which can be really useful for motion blur. But motion blur is handled by basically cinema, unless it's on a plant or a texture. And even then, it's still mostly calculated by cinema. For the most part, your motion blur settings should show up and match up to the way cinema is set. You can also choose to obviously turn off the atmosphere or the sky, rendering objects, and then the post-processing effects as well. It's normally a good idea to just kind of keep the post-process effects off when you're rendering and just kind of take care of everything in post. Because you don't want to have to make too many changes back and forth between the renderers, and Vue's post-processing effects can make some really huge differences between the two renderers. So it's usually good just to kind of keep those off, unless you have almost all view elements in the scene. You're just kind of using cinema to render them. Now I'm going to turn down just the render setting, bring it back to geometry. And actually, if we set this to none, it should render even faster. with absolutely no anti-aliasing on anything. But for the most part, if we take a look at the view objects, they kind of look the same way they did before when we were using the geometry setting. So turning it off really only turns off anti-aliasing on cinema objects. We'll set that back to geometry since the anti-aliasing on cinema elements is typically a lot faster, since we don't have all of the texture maps and bits of vegetation to render. One thing I want to do is turn on global illumination, and we're going to take a look at one of the problems you can run into. And I just have my settings on low and preview for the samples and density. Although the problem that we're going to see shows up at all levels of quality that I've seen. And I found a pretty easy way to fix the problem. We'll just go ahead and let this render out and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. If you take a look at where the claws are at, there are some purple splotches. I've noticed these pretty often when using global illumination and when the object is intersecting with the view object or is too close to the ground plane on sometimes terrains. And this will also change. This scene I actually had set up or testing this beforehand, this effect was much worse than it is right now. By changing the camera angle, I've noticed you might be able to increase that error, and I just want you to be able to see what you could possibly run into. By looking at the pre-pass, we can see some of those purple dots kind of showing up in different areas. And now you can see it on the head, around the eye, very obviously, and by the toes or the claws again. So I did find one way to pretty simply remove this, and this turtle only has one material with several layers that I'm using to make the texture and the overall shader for it. If we go to the illumination tab in the attributes or also in the material editor, you could do this under illumination. What I found I was able to do is take the saturation under generate GI and turn that down to 99% from 100. And I've pretty much found that that has removed that error. So we'll just let this render out. And now you can see it's completely fixed. The problem could be caused by a couple of different things. I did try a couple of enhancements on the geometry to see if it was a geometry problem or really kind of try to figure out what was causing the issue. It could be because I just used a really quick UV mapping mode available in ZBrush in order to generate the UV. But that was a really quick fix. I mean, if you run into that problem, just material, turn down the saturation amount. And I went ahead and tested a lot of the other settings and found that just changing that saturation value is the only thing that's really needed. If you run into further problems, you might be able to turn down some of the other ones to fix it. But in case you run into that problem, which only shows up with global illumination, that way you can have a nice, easy fix for it.